Just a note at the top. This episode does briefly discuss alleged attacks on pets, though we are not going to get specific. Still, it may not be the best choice for our younger audience. And be sure to check your feed every week from now on, because we have gone weekly, and it's very exciting. I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers, it feels, well, odd to say this, but today we are indeed diving back into the murky and folkloric world of goatmen. The fact that we've encountered more than one in our 6-year run is either impressive or concerning, depending on your view of how people spend their free time. Now, a few years back, we introduced you to Kentucky's very own Pope-Lick monster. You know, alleged to have escaped from a circus after a train wreck. Yes, that is one of our most popular themes, but you might alternatively recall that the Pope-Lick monster was said to lurk around a particular train trestle and to drive unsuspecting townsfolk to their deaths. It is certainly a creepy story, but it's not unique, at least in some of its details, because Maryland has its very own goatman. To paraphrase writer J. David Puglia, it's an unofficial sort of state mascot. It usually has horns, but the bits that are goat-like, the head, the torso, the legs, those can change depending on who is telling the story. In fact, sometimes the story tells us that we're not dealing with a half-goat or half-man at all, but rather an unfriendly hermit that lurks in a forest. However, the monster, it's obviously the more popular version, and is best known for allegedly chasing teens, unlucky pets, and various townsfolk through the woods. Sometimes, it even carries an axe. With that in mind, we're headed to the Old Line State, and more specifically to Prince George's County in the west central portion of Maryland, and bordering on Washington, D.C. along its eastern edge. It's an area well known for the supernatural, including more than one crybaby bridge, but is perhaps most infamous for the legend of the creature that's said to stalk Fletchertown Road in the Bowie area. Fletchertown Road is a street named for a famous farmer, Gabriel Fletcher, who, according to the Maryland Historical Trust, was a prominent black farmer and landowner who helped found a settlement in the mid-19th century. He had nothing to do, of course, with the spooky legend that's become attached to the road that bears his name. We do have some idea what that road looks like, or what it looked like anyway, thanks to a Washington Post article from 1971 that we found reprinted in the Austin American. That particular reporter was visiting during a time of major goatman activity, and he wrote that, quote, "The paved, potholed path winds through a 2-mile stretch of dense woods in northeastern Prince George's County, Maryland, a secluded land where myths survive. Beer cans, an occasional discarded mattress, or junked car dot the road's edges. But the forest away from the thoroughfare is not traversed by man. The trees shelter quiet strangeness, no traces of rabbit or squirrel, and birds do not sing." While he was walking through the area, the reporter came upon something that would have, without context, perhaps just have been slightly creepy. An abandoned, rusted-out refrigerator tossed in the woods, with the words, "Goatman was here," written across its metal side. So, in context, more than slightly creepy, and also exactly what he was looking for. That he headed to Fletchertown Road in 1971, it wasn't by chance. Though the stories of the mysterious creature may trace back to the 1950s, or perhaps even earlier, the 1930s, the peak of local fervor for the goatman was indeed the 1970s. Kind of like Bigfoot, yes, except the story here is a little more gruesome. Though some sources note that the first mention of a creature with a predilection for eating pets popped up during the Depression, we should probably start in 1957 with a series of articles about a very frightening creature roving around Prince George's County. At that point, it was a monster that went by a different name, the Abominable Phantom. It's a story that, while gripping for a short while back in the late 50s, might have disappeared. That is, if the Goatman hadn't shown up later, and in a similar fashion. So, in the summer of 1957, smaller DC area papers began reporting on a frightening creature that had been spotted, something the Washington City paper described as, quote, roaming Prince George's County and scaring the bejesus out of its residents. It was variously said to be a, quote, strange animal or a, quote, gorilla-like beast, and described as being hairy, no surprise there, and with, quote, red, beady eyes. Now, as far as we can tell, the Phantom mostly ran around and just kind of looked frightening, which is actually how a lot of our cryptid stories go. Still, per the city paper, local authorities figured they'd better go out and investigate, and as you might imagine, they found nothing. Or, well, that's not quite accurate. Apparently, they claimed the only strange encounter they'd had was with a, quote, deranged and deaf chow dog, who they seemed to assume was the source of all of the, giant gorilla sightings. With such a deflated resolution, the story would have faded, if not for two things. The resurgence of monster sightings in the 1970s, and a Greenbelt native, Mark Opsisnik, who, per the city paper, is a man who is whimsically described as, quote, the nation's foremost goatmanologist. According to the Washington Post, Greenbelt is a small town very close to Bowie, and thus to Fletchertown Road. And Mark says that he heard the Goatman stories throughout his childhood. He even went looking for the monster once or twice, but most importantly, he became interested in gathering all available research on the creature he'd heard so much about. Starting with the 1970s events, and we will be getting to those momentarily, it led him to rediscover news coverage from 1957. And what struck him, we think, was the oddly similar nature of the stories. Sure, a gorilla is not a goat, but how many crazed-eyed monsters can one forested area support? And Mark should probably be counted to know. Per the Capitol, quote, he spent tedious hours at libraries and historical societies, combing through old newspapers and city and county directories. He tracked down old-timers in bars and tape-recorded the interviews. He visited scenes where history occurred. There was something else that Mark turned up too. Some of the families who'd been on Fletchertown Road the longest, among them the Fletchers, as in the road's namesake, they did not claim to have seen any monster roaming the woods. But they did know the stories. However, to them, the Goatman was something older and quieter. Not a creature anyone had spotted, but a story you told the children. The thing that grown-ups warned about to keep kids close to home. Behave, or the Goatman will get you. Now, Mark's commitment to digging up old stories meant that he eventually found the coverage of the Phantom. Quote, the newspaper accounts and the descriptions given by a local were identical. A hairy creature, upright, half man, half animal, on two legs. The conclusion is, we think, that the creatures were one and the same. Although, to be fair, there was a lot more involved in the Goatman stories. For instance, there was no mention of an axe in 1957. Today's episode is brought to you by Vinted. So, those clothes you're not wearing anymore, someone else would love them. Vinted is the app that gets them out of your closet and into someone else's, and puts a little extra money in your pocket too. And that sounds perfect for me because, honestly, my wardrobe has gotten completely out of hand. I absolutely love clothes. I always have. The problem is I have way more than my closet can hold. And right now it's packed so tight I can't fit one more thing. And that's a shame because I'm already planning my fall wardrobe, and there are pieces I've been dying to bring home. I know the fix is to clear out what I'm not wearing, and I also know that's the part I never get around to because it always feels like such a chore. So, Vinted is where I'm starting. I've been going through the app and it looks super simple and fun to use. You photograph what you want to sell, you write a quick description, you set your price, and you post it. That's it. The item's listed and it's ready for someone to buy. And when it sells, Vinted sends you a prepaid label, so you just pack it up and ship it. And with Vinted, there are no seller fees, so what you earn from a sale is yours to keep. The app's free to download too. That means the money from the clothes I'm clearing out goes straight toward those new pieces I've been eyeing. Ready to clean out your closet and make some extra money? Download the Vinted app for free and start listing. With no seller fees, you keep every dollar you earn. And for a limited time, enjoy free shipping in the US on Vinted. We'll be back to Mark, the excellent expert in all things goat, in just a bit. First, though, we need to really dive into the events that he grew up hearing about. As always, there's local legend, there's news reports, and then there are the actually true events that have certainly, changed over time. We've already touched on 2 different eras when monsters were alleged to be roaming Prince George's County, either in pursuit of dogs, or we guess just to scare local teens. But it all seems to have come to a head in 1971. In fact, the story got big enough that journalists actually traveled to the Bowie area to see exactly what was going on, and that's where we got that nicely atmospheric description of Fletchertown Road. In May of that year, though, something else, and something more academic, occurred. Before any local monster sightings began, a 21-year-old University of Maryland student, George Lazama, finished a project for his Introduction to Folklore class. According to a scholarly paper published in the Journal of Contemporary Legend, George spent his time exploring local tales, some of which we suppose that he must have heard growing up. Author David J. Puglia explained that, quote, "The University of Maryland upperclassman did not realize the effect his research would have on the future of Maryland's goatman legend. Lazama had decided to investigate the goatman of Tucker Road." Now, we did spend some time talking to you about a separate road, Fletchertown in Bowie. This is actually a different spot. But, goatmen for everybody, plenty to go around. And Tucker Road and Fletchertown Road are only about 30 minutes apart, so perhaps they could just share a cryptid. Anyway, George Lazama dug into the stories he'd heard as a child, and per Puglia, quote, he collected 8 goatman legends for his project. Interestingly, those tales varied quite a bit. One Clinton local told the UM student that, quote, "There really is a goatman of Tucker Road. He's an old man with a real long white beard like a goat. He's a hermit who lives by the bridge in a little shanty. He grows all his food, he hunts for his meat, and in order to do so, he must cross the narrow bridge from time to time. This is probably when everyone sees him, and as they pass, he smiles, and then everyone in the car gets bent out of shape and goes around screaming about a goat man. I've gone down the road and never met up with him, but relatives have, and they're all still alive." Actually, as Puglia noted, George's research turned up quite a few stories of men living in the woods, ones who we suppose must have looked vaguely like goats, who, quote, "scared local children." But that was not the only take in the tales collected. Some were, of course, more literal. According to Puglia, another story claimed that the goatman, quote, "once was a researcher at the Beltsville Agricultural Farm. The story goes that the man experimented on goats. One day he went insane and he ran into the woods. He grew all his hair until it covered his body. Other accounts say he lives in an old shack and he beats upon parked cars with an axe." Now, that's a section that Puglia found in an article written by a local reporter who was the major source for the Goatman news coverage in the early 1970s. Karen Hostler was her name, and you will need to remember her. Now, normally, we would not insist that you keep up with a journalist who was simply there to report the news. Or we wouldn't. Except for one strange thing. Based on what we've learned, Karen Hostler did not just report on a monster. She helped to establish its story, and she grew its legend. Karen Hostler was a reporter for the Prince George's County News, the small Bowie-based paper, and that fall, she was after a Halloween story. So she went looking in the University of Maryland's folklore archive, which at the time was just a few filing cabinets and a folklorist office. George Lazama's Goatman of Tucker Road project was sitting in one of those cabinets. Per Puglia, it was the only Goatman file in the archive at that point, so What she pulled out was the very thing that George had filed away that spring. We suppose that she looked at more than just his undergraduate project, but it seems that it's what she settled on for her spooky feature story. Because, not too long after that, the first of what would be several articles was published in the county news. The headline? University Archives Reveal Bowie Man, Goatman, and Ghosts Still Haunt the Area. Strangers, please don't ask us about Bowie Man. That's a whole separate kettle of fish. The point is, it was an entertainment piece for the spooky season, and it contained all sorts of frightening details. That the Goatman was perhaps the result of an experiment gone wrong. That the Goatman had carried off a dog at some point, and it hadn't ended well. For the dog. Also set up the Goatman legend in the woods around Fletchertown Road in Bowie, and not Tucker Road in Clinton, which is specifically the area that George had identified as the source of the stories he collected. And regarding that change, we wonder why. To be honest, no one is sure. The scholar David J. Puglia, he had a guess though, and if he's correct, it was quite a fateful move. He wrote that, quote, a version of the Goatman legend likely circulated in Bowie at the time, and Hostler probably came into the archive with that version in mind. This small change, 1 word and 23 miles, would cause major excitement in Bowie, lead to ostension by Bowie residents, encourage legend tripping among Bowie teens, and associate the Goatman with the town for the rest of the century. And that certainly is true. Karen Hostler's article was published on October 27, 1971. By roughly November 3rd, there was a Goatman sighting in Bowie. The idea that this might be a coincidence, it's too conspiratorial, even for us. It's perhaps more accurate that Hostler, in reminding her town, or simply borrowing from nearby Clinton's legend, had summoned the Goatman, and, ultimately, to terrifying effect. Now, about that November sighting. The report came in from local teens. According to WETA, quote, a few days after Hostler's story made its rounds around Bowie, April Edwards and friends John Hayden and Willie Keene heard suspicious noises around Edwards' house. Hayden reported that, quote, he saw an animal, 6 foot, and hairy, on 2 feet. Now, Mark Opsisnick, that Goatman expert that we mentioned earlier, he spoke to one of the witnesses much later. Actually, according to the city paper, it was decades later when John Hayden spoke to Mark, but the story was still consistent. John recalled indeed that, quote, as far as I know, it was an animal on 2 feet. I remember it made a high-pitched sound like a squeal. None of these descriptions from that evening specifically mention goat features, as far as we know anyway, but the assumption was clearly made, and that must have carried over into the next few days when the story truly took a turn. It was November 4th when a local family reported a very disturbing situation. Remember those kids we mentioned, April, John, and Willie? Well, according to the city paper, April's dog had gone missing from its pen the night before, while all the noises and the monster activity were reported. The next morning, John and Willie went searching for her pet. And they found it. While we won't spell it out here, it was a sad scene, and many thought the work of the Goatman. Karen Hostler's next column focused on this bloody event, and per the Washingtonian, quote, the article connected the deceased dog with the Goatman. It also reported that sightings of an animal-like creature that walks on its hind legs were increasing along Fletchertown Road. That was in mid-November, and within days, another report came in. This time, the central point of action was the home of Raymond Hayden, as in John Hayden, who'd been part of the original sighting. This was all in Bowie, of course, and not far from the house of April Edwards. According to the city paper, several neighborhood teens were watching TV at Raymond Hayden's house on the evening of November 17th. It was a quiet night, at least until one of the teens glanced out the window. According to Ivan Goldman, the Washington Post reporter who'd visited Bowie, the teen cried out, insisting there was, quote, something out there. When they gathered to see what exactly their friend had spotted, they claimed they saw, quote, a form outlined against the sky sitting on top of a pickup truck. One member of the party, Kathy Edwards, recalled that, quote, "We saw whatever it was get off the truck and go back toward the woods." The teens did call the local police, but when a search was conducted, yep, you guessed it, nothing was found. But that did not matter much to the young people of Bowie. We weren't able to get our hands on Karen Hostler's original articles on the events, even by calling around to a lot of libraries. But luckily, David J. Puglia was, and he was able to relay the following. Soon after the second sighting, a group of teenagers actually jumped from their vehicles and, quote, pursued a suspected goatman through the forest. They left their cars abandoned on Fletchertown Road, quote, blocking local residents from returning to their homes. By this point, Ivan Goldman of the Washington Post was in town to report, and to provide that moody, spooky description of Fletchertown Road. Something else was going on, too. Locals, likely not goats, had gotten into the habit of writing or spray painting, "Goatman was here," anywhere that they could, which explained that spooky fridge that the reporter stumbled upon. He gathered together those scenes, the recent events, the alleged backstories, like axe-wielding hermits, a literal man turned into a goat by science, a monster who was after pets and teenagers in no particular order, and he wrote it all up in a feature that went national. At that point, the Goatman of Fletchertown Road was cemented as its own separate phenomena, even though the specifics of the legend originated a town or more away. We do think it's interesting, strangers, that axes did not play much of a role in the Bowie take on the legend, considering the drama of that detail. Personally, we definitely would have focused on that. It didn't really matter that Ivan Goldman found no proof that the Goatman actually existed. In fact, he even had a good explanation for what might have happened to that poor dog. Until his reporting, no one had bothered to mention that the pet's remains had been discovered right next to the railroad tracks, and that a train, or even trains, had passed by that very night. And here's where things get interesting to us, as people who love to tease out the origins of folklore. Karen Hostler's stories effectively moved Goatman from one location to another, grew the story, and created a situation where children growing up in the Bowie area after 1971 connected the Clinton Goatman with their home and the road that they knew so well. Perhaps there was a version of the story in Bowie before Karen Hostler decided to go digging in the university archives, but the details she carried over shifted, and so did the fame of the monster itself. And it's pretty clear that that was the way of things. Puglia tells us of another University of Maryland student, Clay Schofield, who decided to go into Bowie and do folklore research on the Fletchertown Road version of the tale. He found that while the population, and especially the teens, knew of the monster, they didn't know the details of the legends as had been captured back in Clinton, and that their knowledge seemed to come straight from what the papers had reported, not their own organic experiences hearing the story for years. While the story of the Goatman of Fletchertown Road might not have shaped the lives of those who came before Karen Hostler, her choice certainly affected every generation after. Mark Opsasnick, the archival researcher and undisputed Goatman expert, he's proof of that. He recalled to the Washingtonian, quote, "We'd get rides, and they'd tell us to shut the hell up or they'll dump us on Fletchertown Road, and the Goatman will get us." By the time he was a high school freshman in 1976, the legend had fully embedded itself. And, as he told the city paper, it was a very big story we heard from the older teens. And you can just imagine how things went on from there. It certainly shaped Mark's life. Not only has he exhaustively researched the subject, he's even gone searching for historic records of various local hermits who've been rumored to be the Goatman. So far, though, he hasn't found the answer. Not that he minds. As he explained to the city paper, quote, "There's some intrigue in any unexplained phenomena. It makes things more exciting. It's fun to be scared, especially when you're young." You know, we have to agree with Mark. Although, we'd add that it's fun when you're not so young, too. With all that said, we might avoid visiting Fletchertown Road ourselves, as we do have a soft spot for dogs and a general distrust of anyone who's willing to run with an axe. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers. From the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and enticingly peculiar, you can check out our premium offerings. If you'd like to subscribe on Apple Premium, you'll get both premium and ad-free and early access episodes, along with ad-free and early access to our other podcast, The Fall Line. If you subscribe on Patreon, you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, a monthly full-length bonus episode, giveaways, and blog posts. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in the show notes. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, be sure to check your subscription and make sure you're following the show. Otherwise, Apple updates mean that it may disappear from your feed. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps.